Welcome to the BCO's launch of our briefing paper, Thoughts on Ventilation Design and Operation Post-COVID. My name is Claire Danahay, Workplace Consultant and Interior Designer from Be Inspired Design. I am a member of the BCO's Technical Affairs Committee and I will be chairing today's discussion. The experts and authors of the paper who will be talking you through their research and answering your questions are Neil Pennell, who is Head of Innovation and Property Solutions at Landsec. Neil sits on the board of the British Council of Officers and chairs the Technical Affairs Committee. Neil was responsible for updating the building services section of the 2019 BCO guide. Derek Clements-Clume is Professor Emeritus at Reading University. He started his career in the building services industry. Besides research, teaching and writing, he works closely with the BCO and leads the Intelligent Buildings Group at CIBSE and the Commission WO98 on Responsive and Intelligent Buildings for CIB. Peter Williams is Stanhope's technical advisor. He is a member of the BCO Technical Committee and co-editor of the BCO Guide. Peter Stocks is a partner at Cundall and has spent most of his life working on commercial office buildings for both developers and tenants. I will shortly be handing over to the team to introduce the paper. We have planned half an hour presentation followed by half an hour to answer your questions. Questions can be submitted via the chat function and please do submit these during the presentation discussions. I will do my best to put all the questions to the panel in the half an hour we have available. I'll now hand over to Neil for some further information.
Thank you, Claire, for the introductions, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I think even before the COVID-19 pandemic, I think everyone recognised the importance of ventilation on general health and well-being in buildings, particularly helping performance and making people feel the spaces they were in are fresh and well ventilated. A regulation requires minimum ventilation standards in workplaces, but I think we're now more conscious than ever of the importance of good ventilation following the risks being highlighted by, I think it was over 200 scientists that wrote an open letter calling for airborne transmission to be recognised as a vector for the virus transmission from human to human. And the growing concerns about super spreader events in indoor workplaces and other places, shops, restaurants and the like. So it's important, I think, for the BCO to actually draw attention to the importance of ventilation, revisit the best practice advice that we have in the guide and try and get the conversation really moving as we start to think about moving back to the offices that we've all left for the last year or so, mostly following advice by the government to work from home. And as we see there is a roadmap now out of the pandemic, we also need to start planning our roadmaps to get back to the office and to make sure that the buildings where their role is to really shelter people and keep them safe is at the forefront of people's minds, and ventilation and its importance in that process. I think that in terms of where we are with our current stock of office buildings is that where best practice advice has been followed, in the main office buildings are well ventilated. However, unfortunately, there are many examples of poorly ventilated spaces. Poor standards of indoor ventilation, we know, can lead to high levels of risk of transmission of many diseases, particularly respiratory diseases. And in a position where we are now, we need to be particularly cognizant of that. And we need to urgently address those areas. And hopefully from the discussions today, we can give some pointers to that. And obviously we're launching a paper, which is the fourth in a series of briefing papers by the BCO Technical Affairs Committee in response to the pandemic, looking at the design and operation of buildings, washrooms, vertical transportation. So we've looked at areas where we feel that the pandemic has, if you like, shone a light on where we need to be aware of design thinking, maintenance, operation of systems that support those spaces. And in that regard, I think hopefully this latest paper will help to get people thinking about the ventilation systems in their offices as we do that planning to return. So I think at this point, I'll hand over to Derek Crume, who produced a lot of the research that sits behind the paper for us and provided a lot of technical and academic insights into the role of ventilation in helping to minimise the risk of infection in spaces. I think you've got a few slides for us, Derek, to take us through an outline of the paper.
Can you see that? Can you see that?
Not yet.
Hello? Hello.
No,
Right.
sorry, it's not coming up yet. Derek.
Right. Okay. I think that's because I'm going to have to leave. It's showing on my screen, but I can't get out. Oh dear. Oh.
Okay. I think, Derek, if you just talk us through using the slide yourself, I think as a prompt, I think that would be good.
Okay. If you can
I
you
think-
put me back on, Camelia?
No, it's okay. The slides will come up now, Derek, if you'd like to carry on.
It's there.
Okay. Right. That. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Ventilation is our focus, but of course that works together with several other things: the distancing, face coverings, materials, cleaning, filtration, and facilities management. It's not just design; it's also the management of the process. We're probably all familiar now with what happens with droplets. You can see when you're speaking or emitting particles into the space. These droplets can either fall to a surface if they're larger ones, or if they're lighter ones, they're carried by airborne transmission. There's also some possibility of fecal transmission as well. Now, ventilation, obviously the quantity of air that we put in space is key. That is important. But it's not only that, it's also the flow direction and the airflow patterns in the space. Ideally, we want the air to mix with the droplet cloud and to lift that above the occupancy zone. The air distribution is defined by the balance of buoyancy momentum forces that you have in the space. And things like temperature gradients, ceiling heights, and air velocities are the key parameters. And now there are CFD programs which can take a closer look at how well your air is being distributed in the space. Now, when it comes to infection risk, there is a formula, which I'm not going to put up. I'm going to show you an example, which relates to ventilation flow, but it also relates to human behavior. It's a very interesting equation. It balances how are things we're interested in ventilation, but also the human behavior. Here's an example from SAGE, and here you see the infection risk here is very high, and then it decreases as the air quantity here for 10, 20 liters per second per person goes down. And then down this column is the scenario. When you're quietly working, then the viral load is less. That's the quanta per hour. And then it starts going up as you start talking loudly, shouting, laughing. I'm going to show you a little bit of work from Cambridge, which is interesting. And on this picture here, these three diagrams, there is no mask being worn. On these three pictures, there is a mask being worn. And in this one, these two comparisons here, the person is just quietly sitting there, saying nothing. Now they begin to speak, and then they begin to laugh, and you can see the effect of the laughing, the speaking, sitting quietly, and then you can see where the mask comes in. And it's these pictures here, which are taken by Schlieren photography, that we probably need to do more about in our ventilation space. So when it comes to the practical matters of air quantities, we can see here that good ventilation above 2 liters per second per square meter and above. And here you can see the floor area taken from the REVA work. And again, this is saying the same thing, interestingly, that the slope of this curve is very strong until about 2 liters per second. And then the relative infection risk slopes off. So the infection risks that we can take are, I'm proposing that in the report, we're saying more detailed ventilation, more care in design about the detailing, that the facilities management is very, very important and related to post-occupancy evaluation is part of the system we have to keep under control. We need to do more measurement, looking at our filtration procedures, the types of, well, the HEPA filters we'll be talking about, but also the maintenance of those. Purification measures like ultraviolet, which are discussed in the report. And also, I think BCO can play a leading role in seeking government finance for upgrading, as they have already in Germany, and also for research. because there's still a lot we don't know. It is a changing scene, it's an evolving scene. So we still have a lot to learn. And the BCO, I would suggest, might consider having a reducing infection risk in offices group or something of that nature, because the virus is not going to go away. We still have flu, for example. It's going to go down to a much safer level, but it's unlikely that it will disappear completely. So thank you very much. And do help us with evidence so that we can build up our knowledge base about the effectiveness of ventilation in spaces. I'm over to Peter, I think, now.
Okay, thanks, Derek. That's a very interesting sort of background for people to consider from a research perspective. And we've got to make sure that we play this into the sort of the practical everyday today activities we undertake, whether it's associated with design, construction or operation. And of course, buildings are a pretty fluid type of places to be. I think a key thing to bear in mind from the point of view of fresh air, that most modern buildings, as Neil already mentioned, have got a pretty good standard of fresh air and a pretty safe place if they're working with current best practice. And one of the first things that will happen in a pandemic, as it has for us now, is instruction from the government for us to work from home wherever possible. And where that's not possible and people are going to the workplace, then they are at the very least participating in social distancing measures. That reduces the occupancy in buildings, so automatically the fresh air per person goes up. So there's a setting with this, which is, what is the background, what's the technical background to it, and then how does this play out in the workplace in reality. Derek has mentioned CFD as a means of looking at what's happening with those airflow patterns in the workplace, and this is a really important piece of design support to make sure that whatever type of system we might be applying to a building, it's providing effective ventilation throughout the space. Again, the practical consideration of the workplace are that it changes all the time. Excuse me, whether it's a result of people simply moving about the space, disturbing airflow, or changes in fit out, which we all know can be very, very frequent. So an extension of the sort of the computational design and decision support in the first place is making sure that we do test and commission the workplaces thoroughly. And I guess it'll come back to Derek later on with this, but I guess what this shows is the sort of the need to do proper design, but then carry out research in the workplace and find out how that actually works in practice to help us build better models again. The good design and the good best practice that I mentioned earlier, of course, is just the foundation stone of what makes a good workplace. But we've got to follow that through from, say, the guidance that might be given in the BCO guide, through how the design is implemented, how the building is built, and particularly how the testing and commissioning is carried out. Thereafter into maintenance, facilities management we've touched on already, to make sure that the design and construction intent is carried through. And ultimately that gets us into this great place with modern buildings as being pretty safe places to work, which are made even safer in the case of a pandemic because the management processes that are brought into place. I think that's really all I want to say about this at the moment, and leave as much time for questions and further debate later on. So I'll hand over to the other Peter.
Peter, thank you. Peter here. I'm just going to take you through a few of the key considerations design-wise, which are brought up by Derek's slides earlier on. And I think just sort of talking through the system, one of the main issues is to avoid recirculation. And this isn't just during the COVID phase, the pandemic phase, but also post-pandemic. Good guidance, BCO guidance, BREEAM, health and well-being through the WELL certification process, all advocate bringing fresh air in from a place where there's least pollution. And so most buildings do take in air from high level, top of buildings, where the potential for infected particles is incredibly low anyway. Going through the system, looking at filtration, looking at cleaning systems. We've talked about, Derek talked about HEPA filters, which are very high efficiency particle filters. These filters are quite expensive, take a bit of space and you need a lot of maintenance for these. So you've got to think this through fairly carefully before you decide to go down that route and analyze the risk of bringing in air from the roof level in the first place. Secondly, the UV and ionization systems. Some of these are shown to work, but in the workplace haven't been tried and tested fully, but they really do need to be thought through as to whether we go down that particular route. In terms of the amount of air coming in, I know there's been some discussion by the government and some particular bodies about increasing the amount of fresh air, particularly during pandemic, to something like 1.5 to 1.7 times the minimum building regs being 10 litres per second. We're looking at changing the BCO guidance from 12 litres per second plus 10% for meeting space to 14 to bring that in line with a few other systems, ISO 17772 and BREEAM additional sort of credits for ventilation. So increasing the amount of fresh air to what the BCO is now suggesting. And I think that the main guidance is 1.6 litres per second covers most eventualities, and that will just about cover what the government's suggesting during pandemic stage. So the implications on sort of space and sizing of risers and air handling units isn't massive. We've got to look very carefully at how we introduce the fresh air into the space. Peter and Derek both mentioned that. Traditionally, we've had constant volume dampers bringing air onto the floor set to a certain minimum. It may be that we can help by using variable volume, demand-led variable volume dampers. And that also needs to be looked at in the fit-out space as well through areas like meeting rooms. In our office here, we have variable control on the meeting rooms where we have CO2 sensors, and obviously you've got to be very careful where you place CO2 sensors. Moving on to a couple of final points in terms of existing buildings, there is a lot of the building stock. There's only sort of 5–10% new build that we have at the moment that complies with all the sort of BCO guidance. But there's a lot of buildings where been designed for natural ventilation originally that have had air conditioning systems added to them at a later stage and windows sealed and rely on sort of infiltration and natural ventilation where possible. These have obviously got to be looked at very carefully, particularly in these times, but more so to satisfy standard ventilation guidelines. So there's going to be a lot of thought about how we deal with those. And I think that the value of some of those buildings needs to be looked at very carefully, and what you need to do to make sure that you don't end up with a asset that is of particularly poor value. Couple of final things in terms of some of the ancillary and sort of transitory spaces, such as staircases, lift lobbies, traditionally haven't been particularly well ventilated, but what with the advent of well-building certification, health and well-being, stairs are used more often. We've got to make sure that some of these spaces are well ventilated. Ideally, naturally, because if you go down the mechanical ventilation route, we're all trying to design net zero carbon buildings now, and obviously the more ventilation you put in, the more fan power, the more energy they use, particularly, if you're going down the neighbours design for performance route, this will obviously affect your rating. And finally, in terms of, I'm just looking at here, I think that's probably it in terms of key considerations. So maybe I don't want to talk too long. Most of this is in the paper, and I think we can pick up a lot of these during the question stage. So if I hand back to Claire.
Okay, thank you all. So I've got a few questions that are starting to come in. So some of these might have been started to be answered during the ongoing discussions, but I'll put them to you anyway. So do we think there's a move away from fan coil units and chill beams back to VAV style systems due to large air movement and more opportunities to add UV filtration? And that's from Richard.
Okay,
do you want to answer
yeah,
that one?
perhaps take that one. I was just actually typing a response, but I'll say it. I think guidance from the leading industry bodies such as RHEVA is that local recirculation of air within an occupied space to maintain thermal comfort conditions is acceptable, providing there's an appropriate level of outdoor air supplied to the space. So I think that obviously we need to do a lot more research in terms of what makes a difference, what is key, how you introduce the air, how it's circulated. We're at the beginning of a learning curve, I think, in terms of taking that into account in an office ventilation context. But we know there are good guidelines in terms of the way air should be introduced into space, the terminal velocities within the occupied zone. And I think what we do need to make sure is that we properly address in the course of design the aspects of how air is distributed into space, both supplied in terms of fresh air, local recirculation from terminal units, and then extract air points within the space to make sure that it's working as effectively as possible, and that we understand the mechanics of that and apply that to our design thinking. So I think it's far too early yet to say, is one system better than another, is one process better than another. As I said earlier, I think we've got a lot of spaces that have very poor levels of ventilation amongst some of the workplace settings that we see. And I think the first priority is to make sure that spaces that people are going to be in are well ventilated, and that the systems that we have are properly maintained, properly commissioned, and do the role they're intended to. I think there was a second part to your question, Richard, which was on UV filtration and other technologies. We have covered those in the paper, and we've also, in support of the main paper, there's a supplementary paper that goes into a bit more detail into some of those technologies. Again, I would urge caution in their use. We're still at a stage where we have only limited evidence as to their efficiency. We know that UV is able to obviously kill viruses and bacteria. How it's used in the context of ventilation solutions in space is a learning curve, I think, that we're on. I think other technologies, as I say, there's very little evidence yet against effectiveness on COVID-19, for example. So an air of caution there, and certainly they should never be considered as a substitute in any way for good ventilation and good outdoor air supply to space.
Thank you, Neil. Jeff has thrown a question in here to say that is a general thought to increase the ventilation rate above the current codes, and if so, will we need to get smarter on our heat recovery systems from exhaust air, so to try to minimise the energy consumption? Is here the feel to how much extra this might cost per square metre over current practice?
Could I have a go at that one, Claire?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, I think again it's important to put this in context, because we're talking about if you like, health and well-being in an office under normal circumstances, and what might happen during a period of a pandemic when there's a high infective load in the space. If the first measure that's taken is to send people home and to introduce social distancing, the number of people in the office space will reduce dramatically. And you can all see that. I mean, you can all look at Peter Stocks's office behind him, and I think he must have more outdoor air than anybody else in the world. So I think it's important not to simply take a knee jerk to say that we have to do this all the time, and think that a good base design allows good management procedures afterwards to increase the amount of fresh air. We have talked about what should be the basic level of, I'm just going to apologise here before Steve Wisme shouts at me about calling it fresh air instead of outside air. I'll try and call it outside air, but I get picked up by my mates so much who say, what is outdoor air? Can you please call it fresh air? It's a double-pronged thing. We have looked at what are the minimum levels of fresh air recommended. As you probably know at the moment, the guide suggests 12 litres per second per person, plus 10% to allow for fit-out flexibility. That's about 13.2 litres a second. We have decided to update the guide to make the minimum allowance 14 litres a second per person, and that's to bring it in line with, I think it's BS ISO 1772, which brings us on a par with our European colleagues, and also ties up through the BREEAM credits that Peter S mentioned earlier on for indoor environmental quality. So we will be suggesting proposing an increase to the minimum fresh air level, but it's not a huge increase, and likely well within the capacity of many of the sort of systems that we have already. I see you nodding there, Peter, so perhaps you'd like to pick this one up as well. And you're on mute, mate.
For it. Yes, no, you're absolutely right. I think the amount of fresh air that we're talking about here is not a massive increase from before. And I think I mentioned a minute ago that, government guidelines was trying to increase it during a pandemic. But I think Peter also mentioned that during a pandemic, management processes such as working from home and split shifts and things increase the amount of fresh air anyway. So I'm sure that that's going to be taken into account by most people. So I don't think it's a massive increase. I think, Jeff, you mentioned about energy consumption. A lot of the heat recovery systems are pretty efficient at the moment. There's always a little bit more to be got out of systems, and I think there will be some slight improvements, and that will probably counter the increases that we might see, slight increases that we might see. But I think, as Peter said, this is mainly to bring us into line with our European neighbours, despite Brexit, and to make sure that all the different guidelines align. I think that's all.
Thanks both. So it's some interesting points there, and I think one of the things that I think that's come through on a number of the questions, and I'll pick up on those in a minute, is about how the current buildings are obviously being designed to good best practice, and there is a lot of more recent buildings that probably are not that difficult to manage or adapt. But what about when we're talking about longer term existing buildings? Jeff has raised a point about the fact that we'll be increasing the flow rates on existing systems. Would that potentially cause a noise issue within the space? And also the potential risks to property and landlord portfolios in terms of the cost and the occupancy potentials for existing properties. I don't know who would like to pick up on that.
I think that I think Peter sort of touched on this earlier, that we believe that buildings that are designed to a good standard at this moment in time are acceptable in terms of minimizing the risk to people in those places. We do have, I think, some offices that are not so well ventilated, and we do need to I think everybody needs to sort of review their systems, their space. I think there's an obligation to do that anyway when you're doing your risk assessments for the return back to the use of the office as the regulations start to be relaxed and we start to get pointers as to the dates of when the move back to working in offices can begin in earnest. Apart from at the moment, obviously, it's only I think for those that are key workers and need to be in work that should not be working from home, or those that cannot work from home. So as that guidance changes, we need to move back. There's obligations, I think, on operators of buildings and employers to ensure that the risk assessments are done. So I'm sure that people will be reviewing the ventilation systems. It's important, as we said earlier, that the systems we have are working at their best capacity, that they have been well maintained, that the distribution in the space is as good as it can be. And we need to, I think we touch on the paper as well, that perhaps an area, even when we have well ventilated spaces, the layout of spaces can change. We know that the flexible use of space has sort of accelerated in recent years, and the way that we move people around and the way that spaces are utilised changes. So I think what's important is we should also be aware of that, with ensuring that our ventilation systems keep pace with, if you like, the use of the space and the concentration of occupancy in different areas, etc. So I think it's about looking at what you have, making sure it's working at its best capability. If there are some deficiencies, thinking about what you ought to be investing in enhancements. And I think in new buildings going forward, we need to take the best practice advice alongside with the latest research and thinking into our consideration of how we develop and continue to improve systems going forward. But I think the risk at the moment is to make sure that we don't have bad ventilation and people are exposed to unnecessary risks and just poor conditions in which to work. We started off by saying, we're dealing with a particular issue at the moment with the pandemic, and the focus needs to be on that. But outside of that, we all know that the health and well-being of spaces, the mental capability of people when they're operating in spaces is impacted on the indoor air quality. And we need to ensure that indoor air quality is as good as it can be. In terms of the balance with energy, I think we have to balance all things in the decisions we make around design, operation, and maintenance of buildings. As Peter has said, the use of outside air, given that we're in a relatively temperate climate in the UK, actually has benefits through the year that can help offset other energy use in the building in terms of the free cooling that fresh air can provide. So let's concentrate on the bad spaces, get them right. Let's make sure that the good spaces are working properly. That, I think, is for me the priority for now. And then we will continue to look at this area, and we'll continue to update our guidance as we go forward.
Thank you, Neil. A little bit following on from that, Steve has asked a couple of questions of kind of, will lift shafts and cars now be ventilated, in which we have talked about those common areas previously on how they might be dealt with within buildings, and also should meeting rooms or small spaces be include air quality sensors, primarily CO2 sensing, to act as a proxy to determine if it's well ventilated.
Yes, shall I say something on that? I did mention that it's very important that we do far more measurement, and I would say that this applies to not just small spaces, but also larger spaces. CO2 is a proxy for the quality of ventilation. It's not an absolute, but it's a good indicator. We should be aiming for about 800 parts per million, ideally. That's what we should be aiming for. So to have, you need to have an indicator measurement in spaces, much more. And there are now quite cheap, but very reliable in EEQ sensors, actually indoor environmental quality, which includes CO2, which you can purchase. And this gives, feedback and helps you to operate your system in a better way.
I think there's just something I'd like to add on that in terms of, there's two questions there. One is the lift shafts and cars being ventilated to prevent possible viral load. I think what we're trying to do here is provide guidance for the future post-pandemic, but also to understand how, as the other Peter said, management processes can deal with pandemic situations. I know most lift cars at the moment, similar to our office building here, have maximum of 1 without a face mask, 2 with face masks facing opposite directions. So I think during a pandemic, we will deal with it sort of using management processes, but it is a good point that they're not normally ventilated. So that's something Neil might comment on in a second. The other is in terms of measurement, and another question from Jeff Taylor about the demands on the BMS if we go down the variable volume solution. I think that we're tending that way anyway, because a lot of buildings now are being designed with common network systems in place, backbones that enable all the different systems to be able to use a common backbone. And the Internet of Things, the building like the Edge in Amsterdam, where you've got apps on your phone that can connect through to the building management system. All of that's driving to more use of the BMS anyway, and having a separate landlord's BMS that can cover all of these issues. So Neil, if you want to just mention something about lifts, I know that's one of your pet hobbies.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we talk about standards. I think the old British standards used to require ventilation of lift shafts themselves. But actually when we went through the harmonisation process with the European codes, basically that became an optional decision that you could choose to do or not to do. I believe that I think any space benefits from ventilation. We know that lift cars are obviously a confined space, but on the positive side, you're generally only in a lift car for a short period of time. Lift cars themselves are usually ventilated either through a sort of natural process through inlet and outlets that are driven by the motion of the car to ventilate, and obviously when the doors open and close, it gets additional ventilation into that space. But most modern installations also have extract fans as well. So I think certainly we should be making sure that they operate all the time the lifts are in use, rather than in some cases that they're just set to come on at high temperatures or whatever. So ventilation is important. I think we can do some really straightforward interventions in that space to make sure that the lifts are as well ventilated as possible within the context of what we already have. I think going forward, maybe it's something for designers to re-engage in the debate around improving the ventilation to the shaft itself, where a lot of the air that enters the lift car is obviously going to come from that shaft as lifts move through it. So it would be good, in my view, at least, to replenish the air in that space through some local ventilation to the shaft. I think that also touches on other areas within the building. I think BCO Guide has given guidance on the spaces that we use and term as office and workplace spaces, because people are in those spaces for significant periods of time. But there's probably been less clear direction in terms of spaces that are more transitory, reception spaces, lift lobbies, corridors, and the like. And I think that there, again, we touched on this in the paper. We've talked about the use of CO2 as an indicator of ventilation effectiveness. I think both RHIVA and BCO's current recommendation is that you should be below 1,000 parts per million. And that's a good starting point. You can aim for higher qualities than that if you desire. The BCO is setting minimum standards for people to aim for. So that's an area that perhaps we need to think about as operators and designers of building, that we should be making sure that there's a dedicated provision of outdoor air into those sorts of spaces to ensure that there's a good level of ventilation. As people, I think, will be conscious now that it's much better to be in a well-ventilated space, however long the period. And in the case of, obviously, meeting rooms, which are more confined spaces, again, we may have to think carefully about the length of time people spend in meeting rooms and the level of ventilation in those rooms. And again, CO2 is a good proxy, but you have to use it with caution, because it takes some time for steady state levels to be established. You can't sort of react to a CO2 sensor within seconds. You need to give a period of probably a couple of hours for spaces to actually reach a equilibrium that you actually can understand what's going on in that space as people move through it. It's also important where the sensors are sited. They need to be in places where they're actually measuring the air in the space that people are actually in, and not right next to an air inlet or a window opening, where obviously you get false readings. And the sensors need to be calibrated from time to time, and there is a wide range in quality in these types of sensors. So it's a useful tool in the toolkit, but we need to be cognizant of its limitations and what it's actually telling us.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Nigel has a question. Does the BCO have a view on the use of purge ventilation as promoted in the Part F consultation?
If I jump in on that one very quickly, I think, again, this is probably one of those where it's primarily in use during pandemic situation. And I think that the sort of initial guidance that a lot of facilities managers were given was to turn the air conditioning or the ventilation systems on 24 hours a day to keep the air throughput. But I do think that, provided during a pandemic situation when there's fewer people in, there's social distancing, people are getting more fresh air anyway, that once the last person's left the office, if the vent systems are on for another hour or so, then that probably clears the air out. Time it comes to the morning, you could probably switch it on an hour earlier before people come in, and you should have good air quality at that stage. So I think, an hour or so either end of the day will probably ensure that during a pandemic situation that people do get good quality air.
Thank you. Mark has asked, in an old building with traditional air management cassettes, is there a role for freestanding plug-in air filtration units in commercial spaces to give people confidence to get back to the office?
Shall I start with that? And this is a good question, sure. And a controversial one. It's no substitute for fresh air is the first point. Irrespective of what we're doing by scrubbing the air within a space, simply recirculating it through a filter, I mean, that might take some of the particles, but it's still no substitute for, pardon me, Steve Wisby, it's no substitute for large quantities of outdoor air. So at best, I think it would be an adjunct, but certainly not a replacement.
Thank you, Peter. Martin has asked an energy question. We have reduced the internal building loads due to lighting improvements with LEDs, etc., down to typically approaching 50 watts per metre squared. However, we're still seeing perimeter loads well above 100 watts per metre squared. If we want to show long-term energy improvements, should we not be addressing facade design?
I'll have another go at this again. It's not strictly related to ventilation, but just to pick that up, I think the guide still has a recommendation about memory test 55 watts a square metre for facade. So that's very much a choice of the design team about the kind of aesthetic of the building and how much money they want to put in the performance of the facade. But at some point, you're right, very quickly the facade becomes the thing that dictates the overall performance of the system, because it's the worst case across the floor plate, and that's the worst case you have to deal with. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question.
I think as well, it's getting the right balance of window to solid ratios, and that's obviously an architectural issue, but also the whole issue of natural ventilation, and when you can open windows during certain times of the year can help with that as well.
Thank you. We've got an anonymous question. Will the new recommendations be aligned with the CIBSE and Part F building regs, referring back to CIBSE design guidance at the moment? It's best to pick that up. Neil, do you want to pick that one up?
Sorry, can you say that one again?
Yep, certainly. Will the new recommendations that the BCO put out presumably be aligned with the CIBSE and Part F building regs, referring back to what the CIBSE guidelines are at the moment?
As Peter has said, we've aligned the recommendations that we're in the paper that we're releasing today to the ISO standard. I think in terms of that, I'm sure that it's similar to CIBSE recommendations at the moment, and it's also used in BREEAM assessments as well in terms of establishing credits in that process, which is often something in terms of BREEAM that's required through planning on a lot of buildings, even though it's not a regulation in itself. It's quite often a sort of pseudo regulation, if you like, in the way that we design buildings going forward. So I think that we'll continue to look at what happens in terms of the consultations that are going on. As I think was mentioned earlier, we're aware that there's conversations between SAGE and government at the moment. They're looking at minimum regulations for workplaces. As we see the new guidance emerging and the consultations on that, and the BCO will be active in that dialogue. We'll continually review the recommendations that we have, but for the moment, we believe that this slight increase to at least bring us in line with that ISO standard is where the BCO is going to go with its recommendations.
If I could just say a further point, where you see that in our report, we refer a lot to REVA, which is the European Heating and Ventilating Association. They've done a lot of work. Now, they had a European committee sitting on that, and CIBSE are members of REVA, and they've been in the process of establishing the figures that we put in the report. So there is some coherence there.
This does go back to one of the questions, I think it was Richard Baldwin mentioned about occupancy density, because again, the guide does suggest sort of high density offices at 1 per 8 and medium density at sort of 1 per 10. The current, I think the latest study on it showed that we had increased our density slightly to about 1 per 9.6, I think it is at the moment. And it will be interesting to see post-pandemic if office use changes slightly, because we've been carrying out a lot of studies, as have many organisations, about how the office space will be organised when people do return to return to work. And I think that a lot of people are looking at having similar sort of reasonably high densities for the workspace, but having more breakout space and some spaces for sort of quiet contemplative working cells where people can go and sit down and not be interrupted. But I do think that the overall mix probably equates to a very similar occupancy density that we have at the moment. I don't think we're looking at getting any tighter, and I don't think that this pandemic despite the fact a lot of people have talked about social distancing and having larger spaces, we may end up with more agile working, with the working from home being shown to work and more people having days at home rather than the office. And a lot of employers will look at that and say, well, hang on a minute, it's sort of 60% occupied at the best of times. If half of these people spend 2 more days a week at home, the office is going to be 40% occupied. So can drive the kind of occupancy that I mentioned a minute ago. I don't know if anybody else on the panel's got any.
Yeah, there's a bit of feedback from the recent. There's a BCO webinar on feedback from the Government Hubs programme, where they carried out a lot of research, both before and after the pandemic. If you haven't looked at it, I do commend that to you. And whilst he's suggesting that, I think for them it's moved from, and my memory may be slightly adrift here, it was most people imagining working at home 1 day per week and in the office 4 days per week. That seems to have moved more towards maybe as much as 3 at home and 2 at work. But the significant thing there is that if people are going to work, they want to go to work at the same time as their colleagues, so they have the chance to, participate in those creative workshops, project settings, and so on. So the density in office at a given time may not drop quite as much as we expect. Clearly, we're going to find out how that plays out. But picking up on your point, Peter, then that also goes hand in hand with a different version of the FITO. So perhaps where the starting point for us might have been a setting which was based around lots of rows of bench desking. It's probably a case now of perhaps still some pretty dense desking for people to use that whilst they're there and very carefully managed, but the rest of it given over to alternative workplace settings of project rooms, breakout areas, and so on, that are the reasons that people want to go back to collaborate with their colleagues. And this is really just at a start, but this is certainly some of the things that we're seeing in some of the corporate's proposals for how they're going to persuade and enable their staff to come back to the workplace.
Yes, I think that's some very good points by both Peters there. Slide 10, and you will be able to see this because I think BCO will send you a copy of all what's been said today. You can see a relationship between CO2 and floor area per person. And you will see there's a change of slope at about 12 square meters per person. But I do think the way we use the space is probably more important. As regards infection risk, small meeting rooms are the ones to worry about. The large open spaces, there's more scope for dealing with the air and the pathogens. In small spaces, it's much more difficult. So again, you have to arrange your work and the number of people in spaces and so on very carefully. And the report gives you some indicators about that. I should add that in the supplementary material, there's an exhaustive reference and bibliography. We've worked very hard to collect all the most recent evidence there is. But the briefing note itself is reasonably short. And I suspect that this is only step 1. I think there will be further progression on this question of ventilation, which will be more helpful to answer some of your questions I see. I'm trying to answer some of the questions by writing them down, not all of them, but some of them. But do feel free, if there's something that's particularly not answered today, to come, well, certainly back to me or anyone else. I think we're all happy to relate with you about particular matters that you wish to take up in more detail.
There is one question that's been cropping up a couple of times now, which is about low-level air ventilation. David Hughes has mentioned it, hasn't been answered, about the fact that fan core units do blow air around and distribute particles, and maybe distribution system via the floor void would create less of that. It's probably something Derek can talk about in a second, but I think, when we design the systems, we design them to mix the air and prevent drafts, and that we have to do that at low level as well. A pure displacement system where there's a pool of cool air at low level, which gradually rises and takes all the pollutants out. has been addressed in this report to be reviewed, but traditionally those do need higher floor to ceiling heights. They need more air moved around and larger air handling units. So, you know, it's just a case of reviewing that during the early stages of design. Derek, I know you've spent a lot of time looking at the air movement. Is there any thoughts you have on that?
Well, I mean, your last point, I mean, we probably all know that low height ceiling spaces are more difficult for ventilation. Having said that, you know, for existing buildings, you know, that's more difficult to alter. But what we ideally need to do is to mix the air with the pathogens and then lift that above the occupancy head level. Now, this can be done in different ways. The displacement system is one way, but on the other hand, as we've said, you have to have enough momentum in the air, so the air velocities have to be sufficient to do that. On the other hand, they don't want to give you draft at foot level as well. And this is why I put on one of my slides that to be absolute about this, we really do need to do more airflow modelling, and this does take place. The Cambridge people are, University of Cambridge, for example, are doing. I think Arabs do some of this too. So to answer your question to a better level, we need much more work on understanding the air distribution from the various systems we have, because a lot of it we're kind of guessing by look and feel sort of thing. We need to be a bit more precise about this. And this is recognized in Germany, who are very good in this area, and that they are spending, they've got government money to do this now. So there's an intense research effort to actually understand our airflow systems in the space, how they operate in more detail.
I think as well, the extracts, and Neil and I have spoken about this in terms of the fact that we tend to have bell mouth extracts and extract from one point on in the ceiling plenum for majority of systems, fan cores particularly. And you know, we did debate the idea of making sure that certainly cellular offices get their own separate extract to make sure you get sufficient dilution of the pathogens, and also maybe, depending on the size of the zone, more extract points within the ceiling void space. Neil, I don't know if you've got any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think picking up on what Derek said as well, there's not enough evidence to really differentiate between the systems that we are commonly using in office space at the moment. So a lot more research needed. There's positives and negatives, I think, to both displacement and mixing ventilation. If you start to read some of the papers that you know, we've got in the bibliography, so we do need to really investigate that into a lot more depth before we make any judgment calls one way or the other. And I think the most important thing is that we ventilate spaces well, and we make sure the systems that we do have are working properly. As I say, that's the most important thing we can do at this point in time. And I don't think there's a silver bullet that, you know, one system or another is better than another. One UV light is going to solve, you know, a whole problem or whatever. We need to engineer these spaces properly, and we need to design them well. We need to commission them properly and maintain them and operate them. So that I think is key. And the other point, Peter, you were just saying.
Which Peter? Sorry.
You handed it over to me, but I forgot your point, Andrew. Picking up on Derek. So
it was about the extract positions of extract in spaces.
Yeah, I think that the position where you introduce air into a space and the position that you take it from the space obviously sets up general patterns of airflow. And we know that what we want to do, and I think there's been questions asked about terminal units and the like, we want to try and keep the ventilation in a particular area staying within that zone as much as possible, and we need to make sure that the outdoor air or fresh air is introduced to make sure that air is replenished on a frequent basis. So I think that's the key starting point. But when you do start to look at the influence of the in and outlet points, it does become something that does need to be considered. And meeting rooms we've talked about, we know that they are the really challenging spaces, and we need to make sure that we understand how we're ventilating those, how they're working. And I think strategically putting extract and supply points at various points, usually or actually recommended that the extract should always be at high level. So that does promote withdrawing the air from the upper levels of the space. So again, we've got to do more work on this. I think there's a need to use some of the modelling tools to look at general processes and how the ventilation is working in the space. But we really do need to do much more research in this area. There's very limited information, I think, in the context offices. There's a lot more in clinical environments and clean rooms where ventilation has been taken to high levels of consideration because of the nature of those space requirements. We can't treat office spaces to the same level, but we do need to put in place good standards and good design to get the best possible ventilation solutions for a workplace context.
Thank you, everybody. We're very rapidly heading towards 12 o'clock, and I'm very conscious that there was an awful lot of questions asked. As Derek said, we will be happy to answer, or the team will, I won't be, not my field of expertise, be able to answer questions that you've put in after the session, so that we can come back to you. Just as a final point, is there any key point from any of you that you think is a good leaving point as a key tip for the designers here?
Yeah, I'd like to just sort of say as wrapping up that we are in exceptional circumstances, and clearly we're concerned that these exceptional circumstances may occur again. But our solution to how we're finding things now and in future needs to be a balance between the hardware, the design and the cost of the design that we implement versus the management process. And I think the solution will always be a combination of the two. A good underlying set of criteria which form the foundation for a healthy building that promotes wellness, but one that you can apply the management measures to afterwards, particularly around reducing occupation density through working from home and social distancing, so that we don't punish ourselves now. We've made great strides in the move towards controlling carbon emissions, and I think we need to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when there are other methods, not energy consuming, that help us deal with them.
I would like to just say very briefly that, as you can see, there's a lot still that we don't know. There's a lot more we have to learn. So I hope that BCO will be able to take some part in activating research finance from the government, which will enrich our knowledge in this field.
One quick one from me, and it relates to a question that Paul Paytonell's just typed up, which is about sort of what new technology do we aspire to for the office environment of the future. And really it's going back to the past a little bit, in as much as with the decarbonisation of cities, the electric cars, reduction in traffic, there should be the opportunity to use natural ventilation. Clearly it doesn't work for all buildings, but certainly natural ventilation, biophilia, making the office space more organic, I think is where we should be aspiring to. That's the last one from me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. I think that pretty much is going to have to wrap us up.
Neil's on mute. He was trying to talk.
Oh, sorry, Neil.
Hi, Claire. I was just going to try and do my quick summing up. I think, as we've all said, this subject, I think we found to be perhaps the most challenging for us to put a paper together on, because there's so much to it. And as Derek's intimated, I think as a subject we will come back to. And I think, there's lots of questions still unanswered. We need to do the research. I think that if you look back in time, some things that we've always known, I think, and always do know, is that there's going to be a continuum, that buildings designed to operate well will perform best. And if you take the thinking of Florence Nightingale from nearly 200 years ago, her view was hospitals should do the sick no harm. Maybe we need to make sure our buildings keep the well as safe as possible in the use of those buildings. And I think her recommendations for the design of wards and hospitals was high ceilings, natural light, and that they should be well ventilated. And I think we all know that those things all work well in an office context, or indeed in any other building environment. So they need to be our guidelines for us to think as we go forward, to ensure that we continue to produce great spaces for people to be in. And we need to learn the lessons from the pandemic. We will continue to monitor what happens. The moves by government are going to be interesting. The German government, for example, announced at the end of last year that over 500 million euros are going to be reinvested into public buildings to improve ventilation systems. The government over here is talking about ventilation being an important tool in helping protect us from COVID. So hopefully read the paper and let us know your thoughts. We're looking for input as we go forward as well. And it's a dialogue that I think needs to continue. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everybody. Well, thank you for everybody for joining today. The questions have been fantastic, and we will try and respond post the session. The Technical Affairs Committee, as Neil said, is continuing to look at what the impact of COVID has been on the office and the workplace, and we'll be bringing out future papers on the subject, and the next one will be the thoughts on the transition back into the workplace in the next 6 to 12 months. So thank you again, and we hope it was a useful workshop for you. Thank you. Goodbye.